Welcome to the Accidental Experts podcast. I'm your host, Bryce Hamilton. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a child and family therapist. I have been in practice for over 15 years, and I'm also a mom of 4. So I know the challenges both professionally and personally. I'm so glad that you're here today to grow your parenting toolbox. Please come as you are and be ready to learn. My goal is to make you the accidental expert so that you can raise healthy humans. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm so glad you're here today. We have another really special guest. Her name is Dr. Shifali Singh, and she is the Director of Digital Cognitive Research at Harvard Medical School, and she's a clinical neuropsychologist. And so she is going to be sharing with us what goes on in this teenage brain and why peer pressure and also the peer pressure along with social media can be so impactful to our teens. So with that, let's get to Dr. Singh.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to be talking about teenagers and kind of peer pressure and how the different elements of life as a teen can change. And that also includes our brain is changing. So can you talk about what do you think peer pressure is in general? Like, how would you define that?
I think that there's a lot of social comparison that happens specifically within our younger population. If you think about from an evolutionary standpoint, our peers were only people that we had close relationships with, and we would just walk around with them and, pick berries and whatever we did back in the day, right? But now peer pressure is a totally different thing. It doesn't have to be someone you directly interact with in vivo. It could be something that you experience online. And it could be sort of a trend or movement online that you see. And so, for example, with TikTok and things like that, we're seeing these general trends of people creating this specific thing that they like to do or wear, or this idea of what is the perfect person and the perfect life, and so peer pressure has sort of transitioned from this pressure to engage in a specific way behaviorally or aesthetically to this kind of, there's like a new zeitgeist that we sort of have right now with social media, where people are kind of picking up on cues that they get from TikTok or friends that have seen a specific video, and they're adopting that, incorporating it to their everyday life. And so that's sort of our new version of peer pressure, I think, is sort of social comparison and sort of the tension that creates.
Yeah. So yeah, for sure. So I think, as most parents didn't grow up in this time of TikTok and, even Instagram, I think probably most of us had Facebook was like the most of social media that we had, if that was there. So what do you think parents need to be aware of in terms of how our teens can be impacted by peer pressure and just like what they're seeing in terms of that peer pressure?
It's really hard balance. I empathize a lot with parents of teens because there's this balance of, I want my child to be able to engage with other people, and not feel, a sense of FOMO, right? And
Yeah.
missing out on relationships that are so often cultivated using social media. But on the flip side, you can't really control what people are being exposed to. There isn't sort of that filter. And say if someone is curious about something on TikTok, I always ask my students, my undergrad students, well, what happens when you're really curious about something? Well, the algorithm understands that, and they keep showing it over and over again. And so let's say, you have a person who's kind of anxious and, let's say she's, 14, 15 years old. She has some anxiety. She has some, body dysmorphia sort of tendencies. She's not super happy with how she looks. Then she goes on TikTok and then sees a lot of very, very thin people and then looks up how to become thinner. Then all of a sudden she's on, Thin Talk, and they're looking at things like, how do we lose weight? How can I restrict? And then it's this sort of relationship that she starts engaging in online, and it becomes sort of addictive, and that might sort of catalyze a full-blown eating disorder, for example, or restrictive behaviors. And so I think it's something to I think it's something that's really challenging, which isn't the best answer, but it's the true
No, yeah.
one.
Yeah.
Because, I think being able to, monitor like and talk about what they're seeing online is an important conversation to have at the dinner table now.
Mhm.
Not just what happened during your day, but what did you see? What did you hear? How did that make you feel?
Mhm.
Maybe you should take a break, and offering advice like that as a parent, I think is important, because if you live completely outside of their world, you're not going to be able to understand their lived experience every day.
Mhm.
And so it'll be really, really important to just have those conversations at home.
Mhm.
Additionally, I think, being able to um, wrap your mind around what is healthy screen time, and what amount of screen time is healthy. And so making it, and not just saying, hey, stopping on your phone, because that may not sink in. It's like, oh, you don't understand. But maybe, hey, I noticed that when you're on your phone, you don't pay as much attention to your little brother, you know. Maybe what we can do is, go on it for 2 to 5 more minutes, and then let's redirect, let's fill up your day with something else. And that's called digital detoxing, where you're sort of able to put the phones away. I've had, people say that they have jars in their house where they have all the kids, and family members put the smartphones in the jar while they're having dinner. And oftentimes, a lot of us just don't have dinner with our families. I know I make it a point to do that, and I think that is because it's so important to just be able to sit down and be mindful, and really be able to engage with people face to face. And that's just something that people aren't doing very often anymore. And it's going to take more and more work as we get more sort of technologically integrated to be able to sit down and do that.
Yeah, so this made me think of this question of like, so teenagers will often say to me, social media is how I connect to my friends. Like whether it's on Xbox or some type of like gaming platform, or it's, on TikTok or on their phone in some capacity. And they're like, this is just how we do it. Like we don't get together. We just get together on some type of platform. I mean, is that something healthy that we should be supporting as parents? Or, I mean, because it doesn't seem to be filling the needs, like as somebody who is almost 40 years old, I'm like, no, I want to see my people in person. Like that connection is really important to me. But the teenagers are kind of saying, no, that's not so important anymore. We don't do it like that. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And you know, in some ways, technology, and yes, like, I always talk to people about the harms of technology, but technology can also be a wonderful thing. For example, in rural America, where LGBTQ youth aren't able to feel like they're understood by medical providers, for example, or healthcare providers in general, they go to social media for medical advice because they feel like they have better access to that information. That's a huge plus. That is better than going to 10 different doctors who are making you feel like something's wrong when it's not, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, on the other hand, when we're thinking about getting people together, and engaging, again, having that conversation, which includes something like, hey, I noticed that you get a lot of your social interactions online. Like, what do you feel is missing? Do you feel like you want to be able to, go out and talk to people? How can you facilitate that? Maybe having this structured sort of setup of, once a week you meet with these people in person.
Mm-hmm.
Just because, I know that teenagers love socializing online, but what it also can do is sort of breed the social anxiety where, because you're so used to interacting behind a screen and, being sitting with that anonymity, you're not as comfortable sort of going out and, interacting with people,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even if you're, a homebody in general, just staying home for 3, 4, 5 days at a time and not really going outside, that's going to limit your ability to feel comfortable engaging. And so thinking about it like a muscle, and
Mm-hmm.
explaining it like a muscle, that, it's good to exercise this ability because you're an amazing person and you have this energy about you, and you can go and interact with people in different way. That's important. And actually, there's literature to support that teenagers do enjoy face-to-face interactions more, like after having those face-to-face interactions. So it's like face-to-face interactions, Zoom or FaceTime, and then there's the sort of like texting and messaging. And so people actually do really, really enjoy it. But the activation energy to go out and engage socially is different now than it used to be. Like I need a lot more activation energy to get out and go because I have this phone that is so easily accessible, and I can contact all of my friends. Why go out, right? Mm-hmm. So thinking about it that way, that it's this thing that you have to exercise and work at, is also just good when they get older and maybe have romantic relationships, where engaging with the person is so important, and they're not always going to be able to engage in those types of more intimate relationships over text, right? So I think that it's a muscle, and we should continue to utilize it and strengthen it.
Yeah, I love that, to think about it that way, because a lot of teens will tell me it's awkward. Like, it's awkward to be in person, and it's like, okay, so we should do it more. And they're like, no, like, it doesn't feel comfortable. And I get that it's awkward, but then also is thinking about the importance of like teenagers having jobs, right? Like, and to be able to communicate with customers or whoever is visiting your location that you're working at, whether it's a fast food place or a clothing store or whatever. Like, you have to be able to engage. And if you haven't really practiced that, it would make that even more difficult, and then potentially limit outcomes, right? Like, until you were able to handle that. So that's a great idea to like present it that way. I also think, like, what do you think about the idea of parents sitting down and seeing what's on their kids' feed? Not like as like a monitoring thing, but like a curious, like, hey, can I watch some of the videos that you see on TikTok? Like, is that something that you think is helpful? Because I think sometimes as parents, if our algorithm is pulling in different material, we're not feeling the same thing that our kid is. And so we may not be seeing that.
And I can assure you, you're definitely not seeing the same thing, right? That's spot on. Like you're just not. And I'm not, I mean, I know if I like look at my husband's TikTok and mine, they're totally different. I mean, it's like completely different. And so and that's what makes it such an addictive app, and not just TikTok it's any social media app. They're Absolutely. Very, very good at understanding us, sometimes better than we are. Oftentimes better than we are. They can pick up on things like when you're feeling depressed and sad and when you're happy. And people are more likely to feel, even if you're going with the intention on social media to like make yourself feel better, you actually report after. You might feel better for like the first, like in the interim, like short periods, like 5 to 10 minutes, you might feel better, but hours or days later, it will affect you negatively. And so when you think about the type of content, a teenager is exposed to, if you watch the first 5 videos, you're probably going to get a very, very good sense of what the things that they're exposed to are. I might say, instead of asking them to look on their feed because it might make them kind of become more isolated as a reaction, I might ask instead, like, hey, did you see anything funny on TikTok today? Or what did you see on TikTok today? And just kind of opening it up, and the kinds of things that they're saying, if it is concerning to you, say, it sounds like you're getting a lot of this type of content. Like, why is that? Is something going on? And then you're opening the conversation up for more discussion. And so it doesn't feel like this invasion of privacy. It more so feels like, hey, I want to engage in this experience with you. I can relate to TikTok. I can understand what's happening on it. I can resonate with some of the things that you're feeling, because at your age, I felt this way, but I didn't have all this media kind of in my face all the time. And so that breeds itself to, or lends itself to really being able to engage in a way that doesn't feel overbearing or controlling, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. I like the idea of just getting in there, because I think if we don't know what they're seeing, because then they think that that's reality, right? Like that is their sense of normalcy. And sometimes, I mean, maybe sometimes it's really spot on, right? Like it is a good variety, but I would guess that most of the time it's very skewed in a particular way of like what you're struggling with. And so then it may only amplify that. I mean, there's good things that come out of all of this, like you said, but that being aware of that piece. So why do you think this period, like when we're talking about teenagers, and I know that adults are impacted greatly by social media too, but Why do you think that the teenage brain lends itself to be so impacted by social media and like the messages that are in society? Why is that happening?
It's a good question. I think that um we are all humans and we all want to be radically accepted by others, every one of us. I think that as you get older, you get a better sense of who you are, and you have certain things you identify with, that like I can claim, like you have this podcast, right, that you can
Mhm,
claim as your own, which is part of your identity, maybe not your whole thing, right, but part of it.
mhm,
When you're developing, you're doing the same thing as everybody else. You're going to school, you're making friends, you're hanging out with people, you're engaging with society in a way that's very sort of homogenous in some sense, right? Our individual experiences are certainly different, our home lives are certainly different, but you don't necessarily feel like you have that thing to latch on to as much as when you get older. And for some people that happens much earlier than for some people that, some of us are all still trying to figure ourselves out, right?
mhm,
Are arguably most of us. So the the it's also around the time when you're becoming more and more self-aware and you're becoming more critical of yourself, right? And so you're going through puberty. For the first time, you're understanding, how do I look in relation to them? And that's not something you think about as much when you're super, super young, for example. As early as 10 years old or 8 years old, we're socially comparing for the first time. And that becomes more and more amplified. What happens though is that they start to get this exposure to so many people so early. If you think about the only time we ever saw ourselves, evolutionarily, it was like through a reflection in water, right? Like that was our mirror, right? Versus now, it's like you have filters, you have mirrors, you've got like, 20 people that look similar to you, but you think look slightly better in some way. And so it's so easy to kind of pick and choose what you attend to. And oftentimes for someone with a predisposition to develop something like depression, they might be more in tune to some of those things, some of the things that I don't have, right? And so that makes their brain particularly vulnerable to it's kind of succumbing to this reality, this quote reality that they think they're experiencing. And so that's really challenging. And I really feel for, I mean, because the truth is that the people that were sort of, Gen Z, who is really sort of entrenched in this, and more so even Gen Alpha, they might even engage in social comparison for even longer, than us, because they're born with this, right? And
mhm.
so they're constantly might even be doing this. And that's why you see suicide rates of girls going up 186% in that generation compared to previous ones. And so it's very serious. It has serious mental health implications, but it's also something that we can't necessarily unplug, now that things have sort of taken their own trajectories. And so it's something that should be continuously monitored, but it's very difficult to do so.
Yeah. I mean, and I think bringing up the impact that it's having on mental health. I mean, I think we are seeing in my practice, I see a huge impact of the mental health of our teens, and it seems like they spend a lot of time on technology. How do we like what thoughts do you have around how much time should we be spending on this? Like, when should we be introducing or allowing our kids to start using social media? Like, this is such a hard topic, and I know, it's hard maybe to put a label to, but like, what advice do you have in that space?
Yeah. It's hard to put an age, like you said. I mean, it's just a hard question because we can't, as much as we like to control things as humans, we
Mhm,
can't. Like if your 11-year-old is going on social media, but then she sees all of her 11-year-old friends on social media,
mhm,
she's gonna want to be part of it, and she's gonna be really upset when you don't let her,
mhm.
right? And it's almost like one of those things where the youngest person is sort of like the person that starts all this other stuff, because then everyone starts jumping on. Um, I think it's such an individual decision. I think again, having open conversations where you're able to talk about, hey, I know you really want to be on this thing, but there's a lot of things on there that you might not be prepared for or be exposed to. And, having that conversation of, I want the best for you. I don't want you to compare yourself to other people, because what you see online isn't usually all that real. It's the people's happiest moments. And, so it's preparing them psychologically and thinking about, how do I feel like I can integrate this 11-year-old into their peer group without being so entrenched in social media? And ultimately, some people, people are very all over on the spectrum. Like, they don't give their kids a phone until they're, 16, 17 years old. But then there's like a logistical challenge of, how do I know where they are? Right. I can't just call their parents' house phone, because no one has a house phone anymore.
Yeah.
So and then some people, they give their kid a phone when they're, 8 years old, and then they download the app and they see all this stuff and they show their friends, and then they download it. And then before you know it, your kid is on TikTok, but you didn't know they were, right? Or Instagram or whatever it might be. And the visual things are just so appealing, because your brain is still developing, right? So these visual cues are really exciting and novel, because it's like, I've only seen this much of my world, but there's actually this whole world that exists outside of me. And that's, from a curiosity perspective, that's really exciting. And so, yeah, there's no right age. But I think having conversations and transparency around when they download it, what they can expect, debriefing after, talking about what they saw, are good sort of proactive measures to take.
Is there anything that we can be conscious of? Obviously, different families are going to make different choices in terms of like when they feel like their kids are ready for these different things. But are there things that we can keep in mind to know when we feel like our kid or teen is ready for this type of technology?
Arguably, I don't even know if any of us are ready for this type of technology. Like, it's blown up so much. And being ready for it, and it's like, what does that mean, right? Like,
Yeah.
am I ready to be exposed to a billion things that I never would have been exposed to otherwise? It's so hard to gauge that, because you and I certainly weren't ready for it. People in their 40s, their 50s, they weren't ready for it. But people are adopting it, and you see wonderful, wonderful outcomes of that, but you also see horrible ones.
Yeah.
And so it's just a challenging, I know that's the answer I give a lot, but it's challenging to think about, what, how to advise, in terms of when someone is ready. In addition, we all come with sort of different psychological vulnerabilities. And I think that if you find that, your kid is a little more anxious than most, a little bit more down or depressed, or if you see that that's something that runs in your family, that might behoove you to start a bit later, with the types of social media, because the predisposition to and vulnerability to having some psychological or psychopathology, you know, that will be exacerbated by their sort of use and consumption of social media. And so keeping them off for as long as you can, I think, would be a good thing in that sense. And you'll know your child better than anyone else. And so kind of thinking through, they're constantly comparing themselves to their best friend. Maybe introducing the entire world of social media right now isn't so great.
Yeah.
And, we see it all the time. Like, people are fine putting their kids on social media and making a profit on it. Like that's a thing as well. So again, it's a huge spectrum, but there is something to be said about people who want their kids to wait. Their kids might not be super happy, but waiting is as much as you can, I think, is helpful, just because especially if you don't know if there's any sort of psychological vulnerability there.
Yeah. So it sounds like your advice really is open up the conversation, be curious about where your kids are at with that, kind of debriefing after they've watched some type of social media. Do you have any ideas on or thoughts on like time? Like, what do we know about even adult brains in terms of like how much time should we really be spending on technology, right? Maybe in general, but social media, if that's, a more specific area.
Yeah, I mean, there's a niche gratification theory that basically says we want to be on different apps during different times of the day.
Mm-hmm.
And like, for example, you wake up, maybe you want to be on TikTok and when you come back from work, maybe you want to be on Instagram and, then you want to be on, I don't know, just your email or something. Like how much time and how integrated are we with technology? And some people are completely, I mean, I know my email is just, it's just so many emails per day, like a lot of people, that I feel like I have to have notifications, otherwise I will miss something.
Mm-hmm.
And so being able to separate, but then I don't have any notifications on any of my social media apps, so I don't know what's happening or if someone's messaging me or anything.
Mm-hmm.
Hiding like counts has also been really, really big for mental health, right? Like on Instagram you can hide how many, because then that makes us less, because a lot of people quantify their popularity by the number of likes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so being able to reduce that is also really helpful. But to your question, I think that this is a really it, it's it's something that we adults are really, really good at, is compartmentalizing. And we're also being sort of impacted by the cognition, by sort of our cognition's being impacted for sure by social media and how much
Mm-hmm.
we're engaging with it. And it sort of increases distractibility in a lot of ways, but then it also, for the adult brain, we're constantly developing our decision-making skills, by 24 are kind of at their peak, and then slowly we learn sort of things to compensate for difficulties we might experience better as you get older, actually. And so we might be confronted with something on social media and consume that, but our adult brain kind of understands a bit better about what might be reality and what might not be, versus a
Mm-hmm.
child, right, or an adolescent who might be like, I can't tell the difference.
Yeah.
And I think and I don't think that all adults are perfect at that. I think we still do socially compare, but it's really hard to de-integrate with technology if you want to be good at your job.
Yeah.
And so
Sure.
especially one that you interact with a lot of different people, and um setting boundaries again is good. The digital detox, being able to take a walk, doing things that require more activation energy than you're used to will exercise that muscle, I think.
Yeah, that's good advice. Okay, so if you could talk directly to teens to tell them things about, social media or technology use, what would you want them to know?
Um, I'd want them to know that everything that they see isn't 100% real, and that things are curated, that people spend time thinking about things. You don't think about how you're looking every single second that you're talking to someone else in real life. You just don't. But when
Mm-hmm.
you're on an app, you do, because potentially millions of people could see it. Um, it's not a bad thing, though. It's not a bad thing to engage with people. It's not a bad thing to feel a sense of community on social media. And in some ways, it's wonderful in being able to keep us abreast of what's happening in the world. And so use it if you like, but use it wisely and make sure that you're taking time off to really engage with people face to face, because again, it's shown that you will enjoy and reap the benefits of those interactions more than the digital ones.
Yeah. That's really good advice. Okay, so when we're talking to parents, we've given them a lot of information and also teens information about this. How do parents maybe start this conversation? You suggested like talking about like after they've been on technology to talk about it, but like like sometimes teens will be like, you don't get it. Like this isn't like what you're saying, mom or dad isn't real, or like you don't know. How do we confront that part, or like, I mean, not so much confront, but just like address that piece of it of like helping our teenagers to understand that like yes, this isn't 100% real, or that they are very thoughtful and their job is to sell you on something or whatever that is. Like how do we get them to hear this piece?
I think understanding first where they're coming from, like, well, what makes you think that this is real? And then kind of doing a Socratic questioning, being a bit of a professor with them, saying, well, you think that this is like, oh, this is interesting. Like, what do you think about that person? Why do you think they're presenting themselves in that way? Do you think that it took them a lot of time to do this?
Mm-hmm.
How many pictures do you think do you take before you post the right one, right? And so like, bringing the humanity back into it versus, just seeing whatever's online. But it's because I think Gen Z is really fantastic at making things look totally authentic,
Mm-hmm.
um, when they're maybe not, because because that's what you have to do in social media, there's this like idea of the millennial pause where we like stop and then do something. That's like really an artifact of like our thinking while we're creating content. But like theirs is like, it might be all over the place and it might look so organic. And most of the time it's not. Most of the time it's meant to look organic. And that's what makes it really, really hard for teens and younger, especially because they're like, well, it looks so real, like they're not using a filter. And TikTok especially has like that sense of authenticity because it's a video versus Instagram. I think a lot of people could recognize like that's not real. Like you posted a picture, you put a filter on it, you photoshopped it, whatever that might be. People are more wary of Instagram, but TikTok feels so much more authentic because you have creators talking to you. You have, potentially no filters on. And so it's just very different form of communication in general.
Yeah. So what do you want parents to take away from this conversation? We've given them a lot of data points to consider and helping to have good conversations with their kids and teens. What do you want them to take away?
I would say to um to question and to be curious and um be suspicious. That's okay. Um but tread the line of being controlling and invasive to where they feel like they have to hide something from you. Because if you're coming at them acute with an accusatory sort of, tone or presence, like they may react and pull back, and then you may never actually know what's going on. And so just being very open-minded, sending them TikTok. I know like my parents send me TikToks all the time now. Like, and I just feel like it's hilarious because they have such a, they have like their own algorithms. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting to see what they're watching. But like, they're like funny videos or something. And so, but I feel like connected with them in that way. I'm like, oh, like, what's happening on social media. Like that's interesting. And so being able to, don't be afraid of connecting with them when they're watching videos, don't be judgmental and say like, well, why would you think that's funny or that's strange, right? Say like, oh, like what about that was like really funny to you, or what about that stuck out to you, in the way that feels comfortable talking to your kids, because then they'll have a much better sense of like, oh, I can actually talk to my parent about this because they know this, they know what I'm talking about, and they want to learn. Don't have this negative attitude toward technology that it's all bad, because they're going to have to utilize it in some way.
Yeah, and we all do. So true.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we're all using technology as parents. I think we just want to protect our kids, and it is hard because we're all doing this for the first time of navigating through all this. So, well,
Yeah.
thank you so much for your time today. This was incredibly enlightening.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks again, Dr. Singh. That was all really helpful information. I don't know about you, but I am thoughtful about this information. I know it's not an easy application. We really want a directory on how to do this, to perfectly implement this, to protect our kids. But I think the reality is, just like all the other things that we're doing in parenting, there is no perfect. And there's not an exactly right way to do anything. And this also includes incorporating social media into our kids' lives and also helping them navigate peer pressure. I think it's just amplifying the importance of being in connection with your kid and curious about what they're seeing, what they're doing, how they're feeling, and allowing them the space to come to you and also be open to the idea of you being curious about their lives. With that, I will say thank you so much for your time today. Please rate and subscribe to our show. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube, and also keep the emails coming. to accidentalexperts@gmail.com if you have a suggestion for a show. Have a great day. Some words from our legal team.
The information presented in this podcast is not intended or implied to be a substitute for appropriate professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. All content, including text, graphics, images, and information contained on or available through this podcast, is for general information purposes only. This podcast makes no representations and assumes no responsibility for the accuracy or information on or available through this podcast, and such information is subject to change without notice. You are encouraged to confirm any information obtained through this program with other sources and review all information regarding any condition or treatment with the appropriate professionals.
What we're saying is, yes, I am a real therapist, but I'm not your therapist.